And here we have the second last episode of Battlebots. We're into the round of 16. The winners here will go into the quarterfinals and of course the finale episode. Last episode was pretty great. We saw Sawblaze slay the Kraken, but I honestly feel like Matt Spoke deserved more than one win this season. Tyler Nguyen was schooled by the Endgame boys. As the Kiwi say, kia ora to a top 16 berth. Donald Hudson continued his form from the main season and smoked out against Shatter. Scorpios challenged Witchdoctor, but in the end Zach Lytle's run was cut short. Tantrum got a stylish new hat, I guess. Bloodsport made a narrow escape from what could have been a huge upset against the 31 seeds Gruff. And we had the end of one feel-good story in Jackpot losing to Rotator, and the continuation of another with Mammoth, giving us the biggest upset I think we've seen in Battlebots by defeating the number 3 seeds Copperhead. We'll see how all those 8 winners and the 8 from the previous episode go in this, the round of 16. Let's get into it. Okay, let's start off with the number 1 seeds, Hydra, in their fight against Gigabyte, the number 17 seeds. So obviously this is a fight between two veteran teams, Team Waiachi and the Robotic Death Company. I have not found any evidence of clashes between these two teams before now, which is quite surprising. So here we have Team Waiachi with Hydra coming off a fantastic season. Their defeat of Hypershock was comprehensive, and they are looking like the bot to beat. Gigabyte, meanwhile, are looking like they're hitting peak performance. Their defeat of Malice was proof that they can go up against a really powerful spinner and remain durable throughout the 3 minutes. So speaking of not finding any instances of Megabyte or Gigabyte fighting against Team Waiachi, they haven't fought many flippers either. The only ones that I can find were Earthshaker in King of Bots, and also of course Lucky back in the Desperado tournament in 2018. This was perhaps Lucky's finest hour in Battlebots, but not to rain on that parade. Gigabyte has definitely improved quite a bit since. The spin-up time seems a lot faster than it was in that battle. The driving and strategy has improved. They don't veer towards the walls as often as they did in that fight, and of course the self-righting bar is more durable than that. But that fight did demonstrate what Gigabyte should be worried about in a fight against a flipper, which is that strong wedge coming in, shepherding them into walls, causing their weapon to slow down, potentially damaging the internals due to the energy of the weapon, and making the robot vulnerable to being flipped once and for all. Hydra, however, doesn't even seem to want to take the risk that Gigabyte might touch their bot at all, much like their fight against Huge. So this photo has been doing the rounds online. I'm sure most of you have seen it by now. If not, here it is. And here we can see a device on Hydra, much like the de-icer that Ghost Raptor used to take down Icewave in the quarterfinal of Season 1. So yeah, looks like we've got another cowcatcher moment as we had against Huge. I really don't think this one looks as egregious though. Jake Hewitt's driving is going to have to be even more on point than it was against Huge to make sure that this works. The other thing you can notice in the photo is that the flipper is raised. So while there was some conjecture as to whether or not they could use that flipper with the anti-Huge device, it is definitely not the case here. I am going to be predicting this fight, assuming that this isn't a troll or a decoy of some sort or something that is just here to stir the internet up and make people angry, which honestly it would be brilliant if it was. So it's a tricky fight to tip. I think Gigabyte can get around that attachment, and I think they're very capable of doing damage to Hydra. Hydra seems more durable than last season, although we haven't seen it get hit that often. The question is, I guess, can Hydra keep it up for 3 minutes, pushing Gigabyte around the arena, making sure it hits the walls, keeping the spinning to a minimum? I'm going to think perhaps not. I reckon I'm going to tip Gigabyte here. I think they can get around to the side, they can do damage to Hydra, and if it goes to a judge's decision, that damage will win out pretty easily, since it seems that Hydra's going into this not planning to do damage to Gigabyte, except maybe with the hazard. It's going to be hard, but I think Gigabyte will get some hits on Hydra eventually, so I'm going to say Gigabyte by judge's decision. It feels strange to tip against the number 1 seed. It feels strange to tip Gigabyte in a fight that's not going to be a knockout, but I really think John Mladnick and co are capable of going the distance here, keeping their robot from breaking down and making sure they actually land some blows on Hydra. Moving forward, I'd be worried if Gigabyte goes up against Whiplash. I don't think they can compete there. A fight against Valkyrie would be a lot like the one against Malice. I'm not sure if Valkyrie can get underneath Gigabyte, so it might end up going the same way that the Malice battle did. Gigabyte could set themselves up really well here with this victory against Hydra, if that's how it turns out. I'm not 100% certain. Well, here we have the first of 3 rematches in this episode. This is the one that happened most recently. It's Valkyrie versus Whiplash. We only just saw these two fight it out 3 episodes ago. It was the final main event of the main season, if you had somehow forgotten, and now they meet as the number 8 seed and the number 9 seed, and in the one battle that they've had since their clash, both of them have had convincing victories in fights that have really displayed what these robots are capable of. Back in episode 10, Whiplash for the first time unveiled their anti-horizontal spinner setup and used it to great effect, box rushing Valkyrie, charging head first into the disc and very quickly breaking it. It has to be noted just how much Matt Vasquez was willing to throw his robot into that weapon. The opening moments of that battle were not the most subtle of the Matt Vasquez driving experience, but they were definitely effective. The other thing to note is that Valkyrie was very slow to get out of the square. They were unable to avoid the box rush, and maybe if that is something that's rectified for this fight, Valkyrie will have a better chance. In terms of the way both robots come out, it's hard to see why either would change their setups. Whiplash is always going to go that lifting wedge against a horizontal spinner. That is how it's going to be. Mr. Cavity was built to cut into thick wedges and try and rip them off, so it's hard to see why Valkyrie would go another setup either. And of course, the big question is, how long will Valkyrie's weapon last, and will it make enough of an impact on the battle to either destroy Whiplash or impress the judges? Leanne Cushing's machine is 2-2 for weapon reliability this season, so it almost feels like a toss of a coin. Will it perform like it did against Rotator and Sub-Zero, or will it conk out like it did last time they fought Whiplash and the one against Tantrum as well? And based on that fact alone, it almost feels like this battle is literally a 50-50 chance to go either way. A lot of different factors play into this, as they do with all battles, but I do not think there is anyone that is more likely to have the biggest impact on this fight than the reliability of Valkyrie's weapon. We saw how much damage Whiplash was taking in the early parts of that fight, we saw how much it was struggling, and we also heard Matt Vasquez say how worried he was that it might have destroyed his robot had it gone the full 3 minutes.
They hit us hard, and I was like, okay, if they keep doing that, this is going to be bad. I think had their weapon not stopped spinning, they would have won it.
I'm actually tempted to toss a coin on this one. I really am. But I'm going to stick to my guns from episode 10. I'm going to go with Valkyrie again. See, you live and you learn, and maybe I haven't by picking Valkyrie again here, but I reckon the Valkyrie team has, and maybe they'll have figured out what was wrong with the weapon in the first place. So I'm going to say Valkyrie, and I reckon it's going to be by a judge's decision. I can see Whiplash in it for the long haul, but I see them taking a heap of damage. So I really like seeing Valkyrie in the top 8, and maybe that makes my pick wishful thinking, but what can I say that I haven't already? They will take on the winner of Hydra and Gigabyte. The fights will just keep getting harder. I think they'll probably fancy their chances more against Gigabyte. Maybe they can use Mr. Cavity to get underneath more effectively. We'll see. Whiplash crashing out here will probably be a surprise to most people, but in the past it hasn't been the most durable robot. We saw that this season again against Sawblaze, and I reckon we'll see it again here. So this is going to be the battle between the two big Massachusetts universities, MIT versus WPI, or in other words, Uppercut versus Ribot. Uppercut moves into the top 16, a much improved version of itself when it reached the top 16 last season and lost to Bite Force. Most of the improvement has obviously come from that weapon. Ribot, on the other hand, this is their first foray into the top 16 at all after their upset win against the British Hammerbot Beta. So Uppercut hasn't fought too many vertical spinners thus far in their career. Bite Force, as mentioned before, is perhaps the main one, unless you count Railgun Max, which it briefly clashed against in a rumble where it was already pretty damaged by Bloodsport. This means this is a very interesting fight for Uppercut. Vertical spinners are just about the main form of attack you'll see in Battlebots, so while Ribot isn't really considered top tier, it isn't that far off at the moment. So this will be a good battle for us to get a gauge on how Uppercut combats vertical spinners. The main factor that I think will be considered here is the reach of the two weapons. Ribot has surprised me in the past with how far its weapon extends. It has worried robots like Endgame and Mad Catter, often coming off best in head-on exchanges with those robots. Uppercut, on the other hand, with its spinning bar, it seems like it's going to have more reach over a robot like Ribot with just the spinning disc. And here I'll just make a point to say I do think Ribot will come in with the vertical spinner. They seem to prefer using it against other vertical spinners than the undercutter, although I believe the undercutter will perhaps be a viable option as well. I wouldn't be too shocked if they rocked up with that, but I am assuming that the vertical spinner will be the way to go. I also think the fight against Hijinks is a good reason as to why Ribot shouldn't come in with the undercutter. But yeah, the reach afforded by the bar of Uppercut will allow them to hit Ribot before Ribot hits them. With the power of Uppercut, Ribot will be sent flying, as we saw Uppercut do to Sawblaze and Hijinks. Ribot is a tough robot. I don't know if I expect it to get knocked out. It hasn't been knocked out often. I could see Uppercut potentially stranding it on the screws or something like that, leading to a TKO. But having said that, I don't really expect Uppercut to completely dominate the fight. I think Ribot will be able to land a few hits. We'll be able to judge how Uppercut does on the defensive against a vertical spinner as well during this fight. We saw it in its fight against Hydra, getting thrown all around the box and surviving despite the power of their weapon, no doubt causing some major impacts to their robot, but I do expect them to land more hits on Ribot. I can see this going to the judges. I can see Uppercut impressing the judges with just how much damage they'll do with how much they control the fight. The amount of reach they have will grant them more hits on Ribot. Alex Satori and Uppercut by judges' decision. It has to be said, Ribot has had a pretty good season. They're really starting to show us what they can do. If they can take it up to Uppercut here, I reckon they'll be considered one of the stronger bots going into next season. No longer a gimmick. In fact, to be fair, I don't think it was ever really a gimmick. I think it was decent in Season 4 as well. Uppercut continues to power through. That weapon is taking them to some heady heights. And looking forward, there is a potential match against Tombstone on the way. Doesn't that look delicious? Well, I won't be surprised if this next fight is the last fight of the night. It is a clash of the titans. Ray Billings, Hardcore Robotics, Tombstone against Gabriel Silvera Teles, Team Warrior, and Black Dragon. Despite this being a 5-21 clash, this is an incredibly difficult fight to pick. Ray Billings has just told us not to count him out at all. Just because he's faced with a hard wedge with a brutal vertical spinner attached to it doesn't mean his robot is a write-off, and he showed that against Mad Catter. Black Dragon had a bit of an easier time in their last fight, especially after Slammo's wedge was bent upwards. Black Dragon could get underneath that at will and take complete control of that fight. Throughout the season, it has definitely felt like that Tombstone is kind of on the way out, in sort of the same way that Bronco was last season, but those fears definitely feel somewhat unfounded. Teams are definitely starting to figure out what is good against Tombstone, a big chunky wedge, and very aggressive driving to go along with it. But even so, no one can deny the power of Tombstone, and Ray is definitely not going to go quietly into the night. This may all be much to the chagrin of the Brazilians, who are most definitely a team on the rise. Throughout this season, I haven't been as impressed by Black Dragon as I was in Season 4, and I've definitely not been as impressed by them as the selection committee has, giving them the 5th seed. However, out of all the robots here, I think Black Dragon is one of those that is most suited to fighting against Tombstone. We've seen its record. It's not been knocked out at all during Battlebots, despite coming up against some of the most vicious weapons. It only has limited experience against horizontal spinners at the moment, and both of those were back in its more impressive Season 4 run. It lost to Texas Twister in a fairly controversial judge's decision, a fight that I think it would win these days, but then they defeated Bloodsport, who was much more impressive than Texas Twister last season. In both fights, they definitely showed that they have a good defense against horizontal spinners. Despite losing to Texas Twister, they really controlled the fight and showed that they could withstand the hits from Fozzie Mulden's weapon. I believe that Black Dragon will go with that egg beater spinner against Tombstone. It seems to be the one that won't get caught by Tombstone's weapon as easily. While I haven't been impressed with Black Dragon's weapon this season, I still think that it will be able to do quite a bit of damage to Tombstone, which is obviously all about the weapon and less about the armor. Ray's going to have to drive out of his mind in this fight to be able to stay in space and keep that weapon spinning. His fight against Scorpios was definitely a good tune-up for this battle. At the end of the day though, all those vulnerabilities that Tombstone has shown will probably come home to roost here. The solid wedge on the front of Black Dragon, the fact that it's incredibly durable, fast, is well driven. I don't see Ray being able to avoid it for long enough for him to spin up that bar to dangerous speeds that often in the match. I think we'll see Black Dragon win this by knockout. Anytime Tombstone loses to a wedge like this, it doesn't survive the full 3 minutes. This will be the second time in 3 years that Tombstone has crashed out in the round of 16. The last time, of course, was against Bombshell in that huge upset. Ray will obviously take this in his stride, go back and improve Tombstone once again. It will always be dangerous, but right now there is definitely a prevailing strategy against him that is becoming harder and harder to avoid. So if this happens, Black Dragon moves on to the quarterfinals, and we may see a 4 versus 5 fight between them and Uppercut, and that is a robot that might actually knock out Black Dragon. So here we have the 218 matchup between two rising stars. It is Bloodsport and Tantrum. Justin Marple has rightly earned the 2 seed during the main season, cutting a sway through his competitors, but found it very difficult to get over Gruff in the round of 32. With the tri-bar breaking upon first impact, he had to rely on his superior driving skills to get around Sam McCamus and his mighty flamethrower. It was a scary moment for Bloodsport, who could have gone the same way as Copperhead, but Bloodsport proved to have more up its sleeve than just its weapon. Iron Hill and Tantrum also had a bit of a scare in their round of 32 clash with the 15th seed Fusion. One driving error nearly destroyed their weapon entirely, but in the end the driving ability and the durability of Tantrum won out against the flaming Fusion. In that fight, Tantrum once again demonstrated, as they did against Valkyrie, that they are quite proficient going in against horizontal spinners, and a lot like Gruff will certainly provide a challenge for Team Bots and stuff. Iron Hill took note of that fight, saw there was a bit to learn, and is apparently going in with a similar setup as Gruff did with those quote-unquote chocolate bars at the front of the robot. These are chunks of metal welded to the front of the robot, designed to catch the horizontal spinner, and this seems to be the main reason that Bloodsport's weapon broke so quickly. Team Bloodsport will no doubt have learnt from that as well, and may go in with another of their weapon configurations. The one that they used against Scorpios definitely looks like it would be less prone to breaking in such a manner, but they'd still have others to choose from. Speaking of weaponry, I'm expecting Iron Hill to be a little bit more conservative with his use of the punching spinner in this fight, seeing the damage that the carriage took from that one hit from Fusion. So as I've said, we've seen Tantrum go against a couple of horizontal spinners this season and do really well. The one thing I reckon Bloodsport does have that the others didn't is a fast robot with good maneuverability, the ability to make space for itself in the arena and get away from Tantrum or any other robot when it's trying to pursue it, box it in, and stop that weapon from spinning. This fact will mean that Bloodsport can get its weapon up to speed more often than the others could, come in for harder hits, and I think we'll see Tantrum struggle to cope with the damage. We already saw it in its last fight against Fusion, stopping and starting pretty erratically, and that shows that Fusion's weapon was really hurting it. So it's hard to see it stand up for a full 3 minutes against a robot as good as Bloodsport. I'm still on the hype train, don't get me wrong, I would love to see Tantrum win this, but I don't think they quite have it in them. I feel like too much can go wrong too quickly against a robot like Bloodsport. So that would end a fantastic season for Iron Hill and seems reasonable robotics. An absolute breakout year for a robot that looked like it had a novelty weapon only a season ago. Bloodsport, meanwhile, they power on. It won't be particularly surprising to see the 2nd seed march on here. They have an upcoming date with either Sawblaze or Witchdoctor, and then we can really see whether or not this is an elite robot. So here we go for the second rematch of this episode. It is a rematch of one of the quarterfinals of 2019. It is Witchdoctor versus Sawblaze. Other than its fight against Uppercut, it almost feels like Sawblaze is sort of coasted along this year. A strong victory against Whiplash is nothing to sneeze at all, but Sawblaze almost made it look easy. And the same goes for their fight against Kraken as well. And I think the situation here is that Sawblaze is an amazing robot. It just hasn't really come up against too many robots with weapons that can get a hold of it and do a heap of damage. It's definitely something that I've identified as Sawblaze's biggest weakness. A powerful weapon that is aggressively driven. And see what they're coming up against here with Witchdoctor. Michael Lately, one of the most aggressive drivers in the sport. They've already beaten one hammer saw in the round of 32 in Scorpios. They definitely had to be a lot more patient in that fight than they did against Sawblaze back in the quarterfinal of last season. They couldn't just run in and score insane hits on that robot like they did against Jamison Go. So now that Witchdoctor has its weapons sorted out, it's beaten Slummo, it's beaten Scorpios, we can treat this robot as it was back in Season 4, I reckon. It really looks like they're back on top form. Sawblaze is stronger this season, don't get me wrong. That fork setup at the front definitely looks like it's going to be more effective against vertical spinners than it was last season. And there were a couple of moments in that quarterfinal fight where Sawblaze was able to get on top of Witchdoctor and throw it around the arena. We may see more of that in this fight than we did last season because of that. But the thing is, it's up to Sawblaze to remain on top of Witchdoctor for the full 3 minutes and not let them get a single chance to actually hit them in the side, in the wheel, wherever. And we know how good a driver Michael Lately is. In the fight last season, when Jamison Go lost control, the damage just started piling up, and there was nothing that he could do to negate it. It didn't take long for those forks to get bent upwards, thereby giving Witchdoctor something nice to catch onto and throw Sawblaze around. I'd say that is likely to happen once again this season, despite how strong those forks are looking. I find it very difficult to think that this fight could go any other way than it already has, and so I'm going to go with Witchdoctor by knockout once again. Sawblaze has had another great run this season, and it just feels like they were building up to something really cool. But once again, we have another case of one of those legendary robots going 1 and 2 and picking off some of the mid to high tier robots like Scorpios, Sawblaze, Mad Catter, etc. So Witchdoctor's making another deep run this season. This means that they will fight against either Bloodsport or Tantrum. They'd go into the fight against Tantrum heavy favorites. Against Bloodsport, well, that would be a hell of a fight, wouldn't it? That's definitely something that I would love to see. So here is the feel-good story of Battlebots 2020. It's Ricky Willems and Mammoth. In their latest endeavor, they upset the 3rd seed Copperhead to make it through to the round of 16. Awkward but effective, as Kenny Florian described it. Mammoth is starting to prove that it is a robot that knows how to fight. Both this battle and the Bloodsport Tantrum one can be described as fights between 2 rising stars. The other one here is Shatter, controlled by Adam Wrigley, built by Bots FC. They've put on a very strong performance this season. Their last fight was up against Lockjaw. They took out Donald Hudson's robot. It could be argued that Lockjaw died to its own unreliability, but Shatter put up a very impressive performance nonetheless, and showed that it may have won that fight with or without any unreliability on the part of Lockjaw. So this is the 3rd and final rematch we are seeing in this episode. The fight that I'm referring to didn't actually happen in Battlebots. It happened in the Orlando Maker Faire 2018, back when Shatter was known as Blue. I believe this is the only fight that Mammoth has had against a Hammerbot, so it doesn't bode particularly well. However, it has to be said that Mammoth is a huge robot. That is quite a small arena, especially when you compare it to the Battlebox. And also, Mammoth is a lot faster this season. That is definitely one of the biggest improvements that they have made. I can definitely see Mammoth being able to keep its front towards Shatter and use that spinning lifter to great effect. It's a weapon that has been effective on robots I don't think I expected it to be, especially ones low to the ground such as Copperhead and Deadlift. Shatter definitely could find itself vulnerable if it gets flipped over too often, but that hammer does self-right it very quickly. I expect Mammoth to rock up with the UHMW weapon once again. The solid metal one doesn't seem to be serving it particularly well this season, and I'm not sure if it could take hits from that hammer. However, it has to be said that Shatter's power and driving this season is absolutely undeniable. Adam Wrigley has given us an incredible performance thus far, and I do not think he is finished. Since that hammer has a wider range of motion and a wider reach than most spinning weapons, I reckon that is going to be able to play on Mammoth's vulnerabilities much more than a quote-unquote static spinning weapon. Shatter's ability to strafe as well, I think, will curtail the ability of Mammoth to keep its front pointed at Shatter, thereby exposing its more vulnerable areas to the hammer, as you can see in this fight. That's a very powerful hammer this season. Only a few shots to that battery box at the back, like what Hypershock got, may end the fight. And that is what I'm predicting will happen. It's gotta be a knockout to Shatter for me. Mammoth has shown us a lot this season. It has shown us that these unconventional designs are absolutely serious contenders if you know what you're doing. It wouldn't honestly surprise me too much if Mammoth got the win here, but I gotta go with the higher damage potential, just given how vulnerable Mammoth is. So Shatter moving on to the quarterfinals. Not a robot I expected to go this deep this season. Just quickly, if Rotator does manage to beat Endgame, it'll be really interesting to see Adam Wrigley's approach when compared with John Reed's from earlier in the season. But regardless, I think Shatter honestly has a pretty good shot against either Rotator or Endgame. So this final fight is one between two heavy hitters. It's Endgame versus Rotator. You'll love to see two powerhouse teams who haven't met before going at it in a finals match. We've just seen Endgame glide their way into the final 16 with a win over Perfect Phoenix, another dominant victory by the New Zealanders. Rotator, on the other hand, have put down the uprising of Jackpot. The upstart newcomer got a lofty seed at 11. Rotator took them down a peg, even from their slot in at number 22. In that fight, I reckon we definitely got a glimpse at what Rotator's strategy will be in this battle. Given that Jackpot is a vertical spinner, Victor Soto went in with his weapon as an undercutter. He went in with the 3 forks at the back, and it worked a treat despite what Jackpot had waiting for him. The problem here is that Endgame is going to be a lot more difficult to tip over. It's got a much wider base than Jackpot does. Jackpot didn't have the wedges on the front. Endgame's going to be all front game. rather than switching back and forth like Jackbot did, like Rotator will here. Rotator won't just be making contact with its weapon like it was against Jackbot, it will be making contact with those wedges, and I'd say that is definitely bad news for Victor Soto. We've seen Endgame beat 2 horizontal spinners now this season, Tombstone and Perfect Phoenix. It went up against Bloodsport as well and was able to defend against its attacks, but Bloodsport in the end just proved to be too powerful. I don't think Rotator has the same power in its weapons that Bloodsport does. Rotator's strengths lie in its durability, its speed, the fact that it's well driven, and of course its modularity, not necessarily weapon power. The other thing about Rotator is that we know that it struggles against vertical spinners. Yes, it beat Jackpot just now. I think that was more of a quality disparity between the two robots. But in the past, when Rotator has gone up against powerful vertical spinners, Bite Force, Death Roll, Witchdoctor, it's been bad news for them. It's been a while since they've fought a top quality vertical spinner. Death Roll would have been the last one. So we'll see how this new evolution of Rotator goes, because as far as vertical spinners go, Endgame is one of the best, and is proving it this year with their strongest season yet. At the end of the day, unless old gremlins start to appear again for Endgame, I can't see Rotator doing much to it. It's going to glance off the wedge, it's going to get thrown into the air by the vertical spinner. Rotator's durable, I'll definitely give it that. That gives it its best shot if it can outlast Endgame, but in a pure matchup where both robots are working perfectly, I can't see Rotator winning this. It's got to go to Endgame, and I reckon it's going to be by judge's decision. So Jack Barker, Nick maybe, they'll advance on, they'll go into the quarterfinals, up against Shatter most likely, I think. Definitely a danger to them, but without the 3 seed in the competition anymore, their road to the semis and ultimately the final is looking very, very open. For Rotator, it was a somewhat disappointing season. If one thing or another had just gone their way, maybe they would be able to get a higher seeding, fight lesser robots, and make it further into the competition. But I still think with the quality of fights that it has had, Rotator has cemented itself as one of the top robots in Battlebots. And that is it. That will conclude this, the top 16 fights of Battlebots Season 5, and the second last episode. So next week is the final. This is going to be it. We'll be down to 8 robots. Just to recap, my tips are Gigabyte, Valkyrie, and Uppercut, all by judge's decision. Black Dragon, Bloodsport, Witchdoctor, and Shatter, all by KO, and then Endgame by judge's decision. So thanks again for watching. We've nearly made it. Battlebots Season 5, the finale coming up next week. I'll see you there.